In the early hours of a quiet morning, Mr. and Mrs. Clifford were driving down the highway. They were in a hurry, and Mrs. Clifford was behind the wheel, speeding along the road. Suddenly, a large truck appeared out of nowhere, and in the confusion, their car swerved, crashing into a massive tree. The car was soon engulfed in flames, with debris scattered everywhere. At the scene of the accident, Mrs. Clifford managed to get out of the wreckage. She was in shock, crying and desperately calling for help. Her husband, Mr. Clifford, was still trapped inside the car, severely injured and covered in blood. It wasn't long before people nearby rushed to help, pulling him out of the car as quickly as they could. The couple was rushed to the hospital, with Mrs. Clifford anxiously waiting for any news about her husband's condition. As she sat in the waiting room, time seemed to slow down. Mrs. Clifford was filled with fear and dread. Then, the doctor appeared with a somber expression. His words were heavy. "I'm sorry, ma'am. He didn't make it." Mrs. Clifford's world came crashing down. She let out a loud scream, overwhelmed by the pain of losing her husband. The reality that Mr. Clifford was gone forever was too much to bear. A few days later, after the funeral, Mrs. Clifford was at home, sitting on the couch in her black mourning clothes. Friends and family had come by to offer their condolences, trying to comfort her in her sorrow. She felt lost, unable to shake the devastation. Slowly, as the hours passed, the house began to empty, and everyone left, except for one elderly woman. This woman introduced herself as Mrs. Stella, Mrs. Clifford's neighbor from across the street. Mrs. Clifford thanked her for coming by to show her support, but then something strange happened. Mrs. Stella hesitated for a moment before asking Mrs. Clifford for permission to ask her a question. Curious, Mrs. Clifford allowed her to proceed. Mrs. Stella's question was shocking and unexpected. She asked, "Why did you kill him?" Mrs. Clifford was taken aback, completely confused by the accusation. "What are you talking about?" she asked, trying to make sense of what Mrs. Stella was implying. But Mrs. Stella remained firm, insisting that Mrs. Clifford tell her the truth, promising she wouldn't take any action against her. This only confused and angered Mrs. Clifford further. She tried to explain the situation, telling Mrs. Stella about the accident and how the doctor confirmed that her husband died because of his injuries. But Mrs. Stella refused to back down, continuing to press her as though she knew something Mrs. Clifford didn't. Mrs. Clifford's patience finally snapped. Furious, she demanded that Mrs. Stella leave her house immediately, threatening to call the police if she didn't go. How dare this woman accuse her of killing her husband in her own home? Mrs. Clifford's voice rose in anger, and Mrs. Stella, unfazed, simply picked up a pen and slip of paper. She wrote down her phone number and left it on the table before walking out, telling Mrs. Clifford to call her when she was ready to talk. Left alone, Mrs. Clifford was overwhelmed with confusion and anger. What was Mrs. Stella talking about? What did she mean by asking such an outrageous question? As she stared at the piece of paper on the table, she felt more lost than ever. Later that night, Mrs. Clifford was finally able to fall asleep after the disturbing encounter with Mrs. Stella. However, her rest was far from peaceful. In her nightmare, Mrs. Stella appeared, looking terrifying as she stood before her, holding a picture of Mr. Clifford. With cold eyes, she repeated over and over, "Why did you do it? Why did you kill him?" Mrs. Clifford, trembling with fear, kept crying out in the dream, insisting she didn't do anything wrong. The terror of the nightmare overwhelmed her, and she woke up in a panic, gasping for air in her dark bedroom. Her heart pounded as she tried to calm down, still haunted by the strange words Mrs. Stella had said. Lying in bed, Mrs. Clifford couldn't shake the thought of why Mrs. Stella would accuse her in such a way, and now she had even appeared in her dream. Something wasn't right. Overcome by curiosity and fear, Mrs. Clifford picked up her phone and dialed the number Mrs. Stella had left on the table. The next morning, Mrs. Clifford welcomed Mrs. Stella into her home. This time, instead of the tense atmosphere from the previous day, Mrs. Clifford tried to stay calm and polite. They sat together at the dining table, where she offered Mrs. Stella a cup of tea. Once they were both seated, Mrs. Clifford finally asked, "So tell me, why did you ask me that question yesterday? I really want to know why." Mrs. Stella simply smiled and replied, "You don't have to pretend, Mrs. Clifford. You know exactly what I'm talking about." Her confidence left Mrs. Clifford even more confused and disturbed. She couldn't understand why Mrs. Stella was so sure of something that didn't make any sense. Without missing a beat, Mrs. Stella began to tell a story from her childhood. She spoke softly, her words full of meaning. "You know, when I was a little girl, I used to love playing hide and seek with my mother. It was always such fun for us. But there was a problem. Every time it was my turn to hide, my mother would find me easily, no matter how hard I tried to pick the best hiding spots. But when it was her turn to hide, I could never find her. I would search everywhere, but it wasn't until she decided to come out on her own that I'd be able to see her. I would always run up to her and hug her tightly. One day, curious about how she found me so easily, I asked her. And do you know what she told me? She said, 'I can run, but I cannot hide.' I thought I was hiding well by closing my eyes and standing by the corner of a wall, but in truth, I wasn't hiding at all." That phrase stuck with me, and I've never forgotten it. Mrs. Stella finished her story with a smile, looking at Mrs. Clifford with knowing eyes. "So what do you think you've learned from my story?" she asked. Mrs. Clifford sat in stunned silence, her mind racing. She didn't know what to say, feeling speechless and helpless under Mrs. Stella's gaze. The story, simple as it was, left her feeling exposed. It was as if Mrs. Stella was telling her that no matter what she did, she couldn't hide the truth. After a long moment of silence, Mrs. Clifford finally opened up. Her voice was shaky, but she began to share what really happened. "Before I met Clifford, life was hard for me and my mother. We lived in the slums, barely surviving after my father passed away. We had no hope, no future, and were struggling to even have one meal a day. Then, one day, Clifford came into our lives and changed everything. He was kind and generous, helping us without asking for anything in return. I had never met anyone like him. Eventually, I fell in love with him. He was like an angel sent to save us. My mother encouraged me to marry him, and I did so with so much joy in my heart. I truly believed I had married the best man on earth. And for a while, everything was perfect. I loved my husband dearly, and he seemed to love me too. But things changed. Clifford became someone I didn't recognize. He turned into a monster. He started controlling me, warning me to stay away from my friends. He cheated on me without shame, and when I tried to talk to him about it, he would beat me. It got worse. He would stay out all night, returning in the middle of the night without any explanation. And when I asked him what was wrong or tried to understand what had happened to us, he shut me out, even hitting me when I pushed too hard." Mrs. Clifford's voice cracked as she continued, her emotions spilling out. "I didn't do anything wrong. I loved him, but he changed. I didn't kill him, Mrs. Stella. I swear I didn't." Mrs. Clifford, trembling, continued her confession to Mrs. Stella, recounting how she had apologized countless times to Clifford, hoping to calm his growing anger. But every apology seemed to make things worse. One day, he made it clear that he considered her his possession, a commodity he had bought. Clifford told her that no matter how he chose to live or treat her, she had no say in it. The more he said these words, the more Mrs. Clifford felt trapped, overwhelmed, and helpless. Things worsened as Clifford became more abusive, physically and emotionally. Mrs. Clifford, at her wit's end, confided in her mother about the torment she was facing. But her mother didn't believe her. Clifford had charmed her mother, showering her with gifts and money, making her believe that he treated Mrs. Clifford with the same kindness. In reality, Clifford had turned Mrs. Clifford into his punching bag, beating her regularly. She felt trapped in a life where there was no escape from the nightmare. One morning, Clifford left for work early without saying what he wanted to eat for dinner. Concerned, Mrs. Clifford called him several times but received no response. Worried, she prepared dinner anyway, hoping he would come home and eat. Hours passed, and it was already late into the night. Mrs. Clifford kept calling, but Clifford ignored her. Eventually, she went to bed, exhausted and anxious. In the early hours of the morning, Clifford returned home, furious. He stormed into their bedroom, shouting for her to serve him food. Mrs. Clifford, startled and frightened, hurried to the kitchen to serve him the meal she had prepared. When Clifford saw it was rice, his anger flared even more. He demanded why she had cooked rice instead of asking him what he wanted. Mrs. Clifford explained that she had called him several times, but he hadn't answered. This explanation only enraged him further. Clifford ordered her to prepare pounded yam and agouti soup. Mrs. Clifford, glancing at the clock and seeing it was already past 2 a.m., pleaded with him to eat the rice and promised to make the pounded yam in the morning. But Clifford refused and insisted she make it immediately. Feeling overwhelmed, Mrs. Clifford told him she couldn't and walked away, heading to the kitchen to tidy up. But Clifford wasn't done. Fueled by his anger, he followed her into the kitchen, pinned her against the wall, and began pressing his hands around her neck. Mrs. Clifford felt her breath slipping away. She gasped for air, feeling her life slowly fading. In a moment of desperation, she struggled and managed to free herself, pushing Clifford away. He fell backward, hitting his head hard against the floor. Shocked and terrified, Mrs. Clifford expected him to get up and chase after her. But he didn't. She looked back and saw him lying motionless on the ground. Panic set in as she realized he wasn't breathing. In that moment, a terrifying thought crossed her mind. Had she killed her husband? She was consumed with fear. She thought about calling the police, but the fear of being arrested for murder stopped her. She considered calling her mother, but knew that would only complicate things further. She stood frozen, trying to think of a way out. Then an idea struck her. Mrs. Clifford dragged Clifford's lifeless body to the car, positioning him in the passenger seat to make it look like he was simply sitting there. She then drove off, deciding to stage an accident, hoping it would shift suspicion away from her. After hearing Mrs. Clifford's full confession, Mrs. Stella smiled knowingly. She calmly admitted that she had witnessed everything that night. From her second-floor balcony, Mrs. Out, Stella had been outside in the early hours of the morning when she saw Mrs. Clifford dragging her husband's body to the car. She had hidden in the shadows, watching the whole scene unfold. At first, she considered calling the police, but decided against it. It wasn't until she heard about the accident that she understood what Mrs. Clifford had done. That was why she came over, to hear Mrs. Clifford's side of the story. Mrs. Clifford was stunned. She begged Mrs. Stella not to report her to the police. Mrs. Stella reassured her that she wouldn't. She explained that, as a woman, she understood the struggles Mrs. Clifford had faced. Mrs. Stella then revealed her own painful past, how she had been a victim of an abusive husband. He had treated her terribly, and after years of suffering, she finally filed for divorce and gained her freedom. Her ex-husband later passed away, and she felt no regret for having left him. Mrs. Stella gently asked, "Why didn't you just divorce him when things got bad? If you had left him, this wouldn't have happened, and no one would have died." Mrs. Clifford, filled with remorse, regretted that she hadn't left Clifford when she had the chance. She now felt like a murderer, even though what had happened was an accident. She confessed that she wished she hadn't fought back, that she had just taken his abuse one more time. But Mrs. Stella encouraged her to forgive herself. "What's done is done," she said softly. "But you have to move on and never let this happen again." Mrs. Clifford, tearfully grateful, thanked Mrs. Stella for understanding and for not reporting her. The two women embraced, sharing a moment of silent understanding. Mrs. Clifford knew she had been given a second chance, not only to rebuild her life, but to carry the lessons she had learned and never forget the pain that had led her here. Thanks for watching, and don't forget to subscribe to Movie Storyline for more captivating tales. See you next time, and goodbye.